spirit, right? So,
right.
I mean, symphonia, this idea of symphonia, this can work in a ideologically, not ideologically, but in an Orthodox nation with an Orthodox leader. And yes, it can have a function, but also there's been how many hundreds of year history of attempted infiltration and destruction of that symphonia by, Masonry, right? Look at Peter the Great, Catherine the Great,
right?
And then, Alexander the First struggling with Masonry, Tsar Paul being killed after banning Masonry, and the revolutionary forces are trying to push them out. Then Tsar Alexander the First, Second, and Third struggling against the revolution. I mean, there was a symphonia there, but then there was also a degenerate elite that was, vacationing in Paris and spending most of their time in London, gambling, smoking hashish and opium, and, engaged in Masonic ritual and trying to import, the Masonic ideas and constitutional Masonic type Republican ideas into Russia. So, I mean, symphonia it worked at times, but also we're in a different time now.
Yeah,
and this lack of symphonia, like a quick example, someone I know in Greece, a relative of mine, is very sick, let's just say, and I had suggested to my mom to relay to this guy, well, why don't there are miracle-working icons and relics all over the place in Greece. You just go walk 5 minutes and you'll find something, right? There's vast history there. And she says, yeah, it's a good sentiment, and you're probably right, but in Greece, they just don't care. They're so desensitized to these kind of things, and they associate anything sacred with the corrupt priests.
Interesting.
So it just goes to show this lack of symphonia and the consciousness of the people is just
right.
It's missing for the most part.
Probably a lot of that attitude in Russia too. Although I've never been.
You guys are definitely on point when it comes to, like, we're not, as far as like in the political realities of the United States. I mean, the empire might be unwinding, and I think we're nowhere near being able to say, okay, it's time for a Christian emperor now of the United States. We're obviously nowhere near that. I think local politics might be a good participation for Orthodox Christian, potentially more effective. I'm definitely down with that. But in terms of like affecting change, I just wanted to address kind of like those sentiments that I bump into often is more generally to do with, well, we're withdrawn from politics. We leave politics at the door. When you walk into church, politics are outside of, the church. And that's like, those kind of sentiments, like, I understand where they're coming from, because we're not there to have political debate. We're there for liturgy. But at the same time, like, I feel like civic life is not excluded from a participation opportunity, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but no, we don't think that. So I've never heard anybody here argue that. I think that would be like a pietistic kind of like, bent. And sometimes so-called Orthodox people speak that way, and they act like anything to do with academia or civic life is all somehow inherently demeaning or evil. Or I think all of that is just kind of ridiculous in my view.
Probably kind of an American idea too, like maybe even a 501c3 type thing.
So I'm going to see, so here we are live as well on YouTube. And I want to remind everybody tonight, Jamie will be doing her live stream over there that she and her friend Kristen are doing a podcast on the top 10 most evil mad science experiments that they dug up. So it should be pretty good. They were telling me the different ones that they had researched and come up with. And half of them I'd never heard of. So this should be pretty good learning event. So let me see if I want to try to bring up the Russ Manion paper. I don't know if I can bring that up though on here. I can take a screenshot of it. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about epistemology. That's kind of what we've been focusing on a lot today. And there's a really excellent section in the Russ Manion paper when he gets to uniformity of nature, the deductive problem. And I'll try to remember to put the Russ Manion paper into the chat and into the show description later. So let me take a screenshot of it, and then that'll be the easiest way to do this. So let's try to boil down to the problem of justification and why I keep harping on this, why it keeps coming up in every debate. I mean, right? Like every debate with a pagan, every debate with a Protestant. Well, maybe not every debate with a Protestant, but every debate with an atheist, a Muslim, a Roman Catholic, we end up on this curious topic of justification and first principles. And we're going to look at some of the reasons why, according to he's not Doctor, but Russ, this doesn't really work when we critique foundationalism, when we critique this. I'm trying to get this stupid thing up on my screen, so give me a second here. Where's the stupid screen? There it is. Screenshot. All right, so let's look at this. This is not very long, so I'm not going to be reading for a super long time, but hopefully everybody can see that. So here's Russ's paper. Hopefully that's, I can barely see this stuff, dude. My eyes are I got boomer eyes. Boomer Davis eyes. Uniformity of nature. Let's start there. Now, what he's doing here is kind of picking apart various attempts in the history of philosophy and in particular epistemology, because as you guys know, after the modern period, philosophers shift the focus from metaphysics, which the ancient and medieval world kind of thought was the first and preeminent of all sciences. They kind of start with metaphysics. And then we get with the Enlightenment philosophers saying, well, wait a minute. To be able to make these claims about metaphysics, what's out there, what exists, what's real, kind of assumes that you have some basis for the knowledge claims, first of all. So we're looking for the question of epistemic criteria. What is our criteria of knowledge? What is our notion of justification? How do we justify our claims? And it's certainly true that Plato and early philosophers did talk about justified true belief, and that does continue into the modern period for the notion of giving good reasons for why we believe what we believe, to ground our beliefs. But you'll notice that with, for example, David Hume, the question, well, actually with Descartes, right, the question shifts to the notion of certitude, indubitable certitude with the cogito and whatnot. And with David Hume, we get a more precise, specific fleshing out of what this problem actually is. And it's a problem of logical entailment and the fact that we can't be circular if we're going to be empiricists or foundationalists, etc. And so we're going to have to be able to deal with this problem of knowledge and having a criteria of knowledge somehow, unfortunately, being in a box. Because how are we going to know our criteria of knowledge without having a prior delineation or knowledge criteria for our knowledge criteria? And this is what we want to see Manion point out with really good, clear lucidity. So he had been talking about why falsification theory wasn't really a good approach to verifying our beliefs in terms of evidentialism and evidential claims, sufficiency and proof. The notion of what it is to have sufficient proof is ambiguous. And this is what happens in epistemology. The problem of falsification is in the same problem as the rest of the answers. And so let's start with this question of the uniformity of nature. Now, universal propositions also make claims about nature, and I can barely read this. Future, I can't read that word. Future, we'll say instantiations of the subject. I can barely read it. But this is only so if nature is uniform. So this is Hume's question, right? He raises the question of induction or the uniformity of nature. How do we know that the future will be like the past? Since that's a principle that underlies the possibility of any science, right? So we're asking a pre-scientific question, a pre-epistemic question, a question that's prior to the doing of science, right? Which is the question of uniformity of nature and induction, that the future will be like the past, regularity of nature. But this only works if nature is uniform. Autonomous man cannot demonstrate the uniformity of nature. And by autonomous man here, this is in the context of empiricism. If you're an empiricist, atheist, finite human being that begins his reasoning process from the human mind, then we're in this problem of not being able to get to universal states of affairs and universal claims. Bertrand Russell explains this problem very well. It has been argued that we have reason to know that the future will resemble the past because what was the future has constantly become the past and always has been found to resemble the past, so that we really have the experience of the future, namely of times which were formerly future, which we call past futures. But such an argument begs the very question at issue. We have experience of past futures, but not future futures. And the question is, what future futures resemble past futures? This question is to be answered by an argument which starts with past futures alone. We therefore still seek for some principle which will enable us to know that the future will follow the same lines as the past. So you'll notice from the time of David Hume all the way up to Bertrand Russell, the exact same problem has been asked and restated. And it's a problem that plagues secular atheistic epistemology and philosophy because it doesn't have a way on the basis of empirical sense data to justify the belief that the future will be like the past. And the belief that the future will be like the past, again, underlies the possibility of any scientific endeavor. So what we're cutting to the chase here over is that science apparently is going to be, scientism is unable to justify its first principles and its starting point. Next, he mentions the deductive problem. Without justification for induction, which is what we were talking about above, right? The uniformity of nature. There is no universal proposition. I can barely read. I have a printout is what I'm trying to read. So let me see. Maybe I can read the copy, the e-copy better. Without, let's see. Without justification for induction, let me read the e-copy. And for uniformity of nature, no universal propositions can be justified. So notice we're in the domain of, again, epistemic justification. These are well-known questions in epistemology. So the people that are getting mad that I've been asking these questions the last few days really are just unfamiliar with epistemology. These aren't foreign questions. They're not questions I'm word salad making up. They're fundamental questions in any epistemic textbook. Any epistemology, Bonjour, the W.J. Wood book that we've talked about. Any text on epistemology will cover these topics. In fact, Manion in the paper will cite many more epistemology texts which also cover these issues. So without justification for induction, again, and the uniformity of nature, there are no universal propositions that can be justified. So we're not saying that you can't believe these things or that you don't say these things. We're asking for an account of these things on your own grounds. That's what we're asking for. And again, why am I talking about this? This is a recurring problem in every debate that we have, whether it's Matt Dillahunty, Trent Horn, T-Dump, the Muslims, Stefan Molyneux. It is always a question of foundationalism, evidentialism, empiricism, and the presuppositions involved in that approach to epistemology. So you guys will recall, every time I have this debate, I just simply boil people back down to this point and ask the same questions. So you'll notice in the Manion paper, he goes on to say, in terms of logic, autonomous man could then make no direct case for the validity of logic. Well, first of all, he can't because of there being no grounding for induction or deduction. He cannot even say what logic is. Is logic a substance? Is it a property? Is it a concrete and a particular? Is it abstract and universal? What is it and where is it? This problem is particularly difficult for materialists. And as you guys know, you've heard me make this point many, many times in the last 5 years, the debates with the atheistic materialists. Not having a category for non-material universal entities, atheistic materialists often suggest that logic is merely some convention, aka a social construct. And then they become postmodernists. They become ridiculous, right? Self-refuting. This, of course, makes logic arbitrary and destroys its universality. That is a devastating critique and problem in those systems. Metaphysics and logic are closely related. Exactly. A point that you've heard me make endlessly. Remember the debate with Vegan Gains and Ask Yourself? The whole debate was, you may not ask me any meta-ethical or metaphysical questions. Okay, but that's assuming that these domains don't overlap and that they don't assume one another. Do we know that, for example, a priori Eastern monism is false? Well, if not, then possibly all A are also not non-A, right? And there is no non-A. But if there is no non-A, then the laws of the excluded middle and the non-contradiction principle, are they even meaningful? How do we know a priori that monists, for example, are wrong? Now, he's not arguing that that's true. Okay, so I know we had some people who didn't understand what a reductio argument is, or making a reductio. They thought that that means that you affirm the absurd position. No, this is part of logic and argumentation and epistemology, is to raise questions that are defeaters. It does not mean that you affirm that position. How exactly do we know that all reality must conform? This is the key question that's going to be a problem for, and I want to raise this issue because it keeps coming up, especially with people who are a little more philosophically astute, especially people that focus on ancient and medieval metaphysics, aka Thomists, etc. They will raise this question of retorsion, and they will think that that qualifies for justification. But as we can see in a moment, I want to show you guys why simply arguing that I don't see how it could be otherwise actually won't function to achieve epistemic justification. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't bring this up. It is important to point out, right, reductios. But reductio arguments aren't strong enough or good enough actually to get us to epistemic justification, and we'll see why. We'll give the defeater for why that is in just a second. And Manion will make this point in a very lucid way here at the beginning, so there won't be much more reading. So he says, how exactly do we know that reality that's out there, all reality, conforms to these principles that we, individual humans, are calling logic? How do we know that there exists a world, in the world, a universal principle that says, if all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, that he must be mortal? Now, I know a lot of people are going to hear this and say, well, it's true. Clearly, it's obviously self-evidently true. But Manion is raising a different question here, right? He doesn't believe that it's not true. He's asking a Humean, or actually a Kantian kind of question. So let me bring up the next screenshot here of the next point, which is he's basically just restating a Kantian type of view. And he's not saying Kant's correct. I don't believe Kant's correct. This is an argument that's a defeater for that argument. Okay, so let's everybody get that clear. I'm not affirming Kant. It's just using this argument in the same way that we used Hume's argument above about induction and the regularity of nature, right? So what does this argument say? Can inductive or deductive inferences be marshaled on behalf of logic? We have already seen that the case for these principles themselves cannot be made. And he argued that earlier in the paper, right, when he was critiquing foundationalism. So don't accuse me of lying or not. It's just earlier in the paper. I started towards the end of the paper because this is where he's going to make the important point that I want to focus on today. Can inductive or deductive inferences be marshaled on behalf of logic? Well, so what we're going to do is we're going to raise Kant's question that how do we know that our conceptual scheme, right, the conceptual categories that we have for logic and universals and math and all these things in our head, that they actually match up to things that are out there in the world. Now, I think that we do have those things. But what we're investigating here is this is a problem for an empiricist type of position, especially for an evidentialist, for this kind of a position, for a peripatetic axiom type of position. Because although we may believe that that's the case, we want to know what is the argument for that being the case, you see, without relying on the principle of induction, deduction, or the assumption that the external world matches up to my conceptual schema from the outset, right? So you can't just appeal to things in the external world or to your metaphysical principles, because what we're asking is a question prior to those principles, right? And he says, more to the point, induction and deduction are methods that presuppose logic. Okay, but this is a meta-logical question that we're asking about logic itself. So therefore, any direct case for logic will necessarily be involved in circular reasoning. So the point of this whole exercise is not to say that we don't have empirical sense data or knowledge, right? The point is not to say I'm a Humean. The point is to say that on the grounds of empiricism, evidentialism, natural philosophy, natural theology, et cetera, and its epistemology, we don't have a justification for its starting points and for its first principles and for its assumptions. And their only response is going to be either a circular argument, which will be a defeater for their foundationalist position, or it will be to be arbitrary. Well, it just is that way. And I don't see how it could be any other way. All right, that's what I meant by retorsion, right? Where we say, well, you could deny first principles. You could deny the reliability of sense perception. You could deny the existence of logic. But to do so would lead to reality being absurd And I just simply don't see how it could be that way, right? We've heard this reply from many Thomists, from many Aristotelians, many philosophers who are a little more astute. Why does that not count for justification? This is the key point here. And all I need is one or two defeaters that are great examples to show that it doesn't achieve justification. It doesn't achieve justificatory status based on a couple defeaters. Now, this doesn't even mean that the defeaters are the case. All we have to do is say, on your own grounds, I could propose this defeater to demonstrate that you still can't or are not justified in the assumption. So the assumption here, right, that we're dealing with now, keep this in mind, is that reality out there in the external world corresponds to our conceptual categories or schemes and the logic in our head, right? How do we know that it does? You might be tempted here, he says, to respond that because no counterexample could be imagined, therefore the universality of logic is undeniable. This is crucial. I have heard this from pretty much every Thomist or Aristotelian that I've ever brought this up with. In fact, today in this very chat, we had a Roman Catholic who was actually making this very point. If you guys remember a couple hours ago, the papal apologist that was in the chat said, I don't see how it could be any other way. Therefore, this is a justification of this question. And I asked him this very question. Keep that in mind. My question to the Thomist, to the Roman Catholic, was this specific question from the Manion paper. Again, let's get this point down. One might be tempted here, as the Thomists and the Roman Catholics did all the time and today, to give the counterexample that I cannot imagine any other way that it could be. Thus, the universality of logic is undeniable. But does the mere fact that we are psychologically disposed such that we cannot think of the world in any other way than logical categories justify us in concluding that the world therefore is bound by those categories? Do you see? Aha! You see the leap here. This is where the non sequitur comes in. Just because in your view, the mental conceptual schema and categories in your head appear to correspond to reality, maybe humans are just predisposed to read reality that way. You see, that's a defeater. Now, I don't think that. That's not my worldview. I don't actually believe that. But it's a perfectly rational, logical, and valid question to ask an empiricist or a person who believes in the peripatetic axiom, or an evidentialist these questions, or a foundationalist. Absolutely, it's a valid question. I mean, and if you think that you're going to get mad because I ask you these questions, well, I'm sorry. Welcome to philosophy. I mean, this is what philosophy does. If you go to university and you study philosophy, you're going to get asked these questions, and you're going to get pressed on these issues. You will be challenged. This is part of philosophy, guys. So we can't let our desire to have positions that we defend to the death for our ego get in the way of growing and flourishing in terms of expanding our knowledge and learning more via the willingness to admit that we could be wrong. And this is something I had to learn too. When I was in college and undergrad, I was as arrogant and douchebaggy as any other 20-year-old philosophy grad. I thought I had it all figured out. And it's just part of the process, right? So that's just an aside on more practical issues. But so back to the Manion paper, let's look. Notice that he says that, again, let's grant that your psychological schema and conceptual categories of logic and meaning and all these things, that they really are the case. What we want to know is, how do you know that reality out there in the external world corresponds to that? Okay, this is Kant's phenomenal noumenal distinction. Kant is really just sort of expanding on these questions from Hume, right? Kant was awakened from his dogmatic slumbers via David Hume. And so Kant is the one who really pioneered this question. And I appreciate Manion's appropriation of Kant, not because I'm Kantian. I am not a Kantian. Nobody in the Orthodox world that I even know is a Kantian. Transcendental arguments do not come from Kant. He uses transcendental arguments, but he does not use the transcendental argument for the Trinity. Okay, so none of this is Kantianism. This is an argument that Kant makes that is perfectly valid, perfectly rational to ask an empiricist, an evidentialist, a natural theologian, natural philosopher. And if they don't like this question, that's not my fault. That's your problem, not mine. Why should we think that our psychological limitations are descriptive of the entire universe? Do you see how devastating that is to this assumption, to this presupposition? A psychological inability to modify the way that we think about the universality of logic does not prove it is in fact universal. These are devastating critiques to the strongest comeback that we have heard so far from people who try to give epistemic justification for their first principles by just citing and saying that it couldn't be otherwise. I don't see how it could be otherwise. Do you guys see how devastating this critique is? In fact, he says it merely means that we cannot modify the way that we think about it. If we cannot answer these questions, what are we reduced to? Many of us consider logic to be the bedrock of our worldview and our theory of knowledge. But what kind of a foundation is this, if this is what we're led to? Do I say, quote, I don't know what it is, I don't know why I believe it, and I don't know if it always applies, but it is the solid foundation upon everything else that I believe is built. Do you see how faulty this foundation is for anybody who's an empiricist, a natural theologian, natural philosopher, et cetera, et cetera? Anybody in this tradition, foundationalists, right? They are stuck with this problem. We are not trying to refute logic. So notice that Manion has the exact confusion and mistake that I have to explain to everybody. Do you think that this argument means that I reject logic? Of course not. I'm using logic to make this argument. We are merely pointing out the inability of man, with his unaided reason, to account for something so central and basic to the knowing process. You see, none of these foundational notions are meaningful or are justified individually. This is to say that in epistemology, there's no brute facts, right? The epistemic facts and propositions, we're saying, are theory-laden. They are holistic, epistemic holism. Rather, they all find their meaning in a worldview that is itself justified. Now, if you've been listening in today's Twitter Spaces chat, the atheist guy that was being pretty belligerent earlier, this was the exact point I made to that guy. There is no self-evident proposition or foundational starting point, even in just epistemic axioms or whatever you want to say, teleology, causation, that doesn't have its meaning within the context of the entire paradigm and worldview. It's a holistic exercise. And so when we are making an argument at a meta level, meta epistemology, meta ethics, meta logic, metaphysics, that is what the transcendental argument is doing. It is in a different category than arguments that are just assertions or claims at the, you could say, normative level, or they're not logical claims, they're meta-logical claims. In other words, they are prior to the doing of logical claims or logical problems or epistemic claims. Do you see that this is a step up? These problems and others are what I refer to as the jumpstart problem. So here's another way, if people have a hard time with the way that I cash out this approach, think of this in the Manion exercise, the Manion paper here, as a jumpstart. How do we jumpstart the foundations of our epistemology? And this is why earlier in the chat I was raising the question of the criterion problem. What is the criterion for our knowledge criterion? You see. This is a perfectly valid question to ask. It's in any epistemology textbook. It's not some word salad I made up that people are getting all mad about. It's a very well-known problem in epistemology. And I'm sorry if you don't like me asking that. It's not my fault. And so he's just calling it the jumpstart problem to help give, a pedagogical device to understand what it is. At this point, it becomes clear that the autonomous philosophers have been reduced to wild guesses as to their foundations. That's exactly what you guys heard me arguing with the atheists today in the chat. Most people hold all of the above listed beliefs. Exactly. right? Do I disagree with the principle of causation, teleology, the external world, the self, ethics, morals? Am I a skeptic? No, right? But when it comes to giving an account and justifying the belief in these first principles, that is absolutely necessary and essential for apologetics. Because I'm not going to allow my opponent in the debate, be he an atheist, be he a Roman Catholic, to I'm not just going to grant him his assumptions. If you just grant me my starting points, I will build my system. Why would I grant you your assumptions in the domain of philosophy and debate? This is ridiculous. Did Socrates just grant everybody their assumptions, or did he question assumptions, right? This is philosophy. So if you don't like that, I'm sorry. That's just what philosophy does. It's a rigorous questioning discipline, and especially the domain of epistemology and the questions of justification. So he says, at this book, he says that autonomous philosophers, this is what we're trying to illustrate, is that the history of secular autonomous philosophy is a dead end. And the history of philosophy bears that out. Most people do believe all these things, but they do so as articles of faith. Exactly. That's why I just bring this back to every time a Roman Catholic natural philosophy proponent says that these principles they're just self-evident. Like, oh, so that's a fideistic leap that you want me to make to accept your founding axioms and first principles. Maybe they're true. Okay, but why should I accept those and not some other? And if he begins to give reasons why, now he's introducing a new criteria of knowledge. But the original question was there simply to ask, what is the knowledge criterion first? Itself. What is the justification for your criteria of knowledge? Oh, let me give you this criteria of knowledge. Okay, what is the justification for that criteria of knowledge? This is called the delineation problem, right? Now you have a list, tiers of how to put what beliefs, what knowledge claims into what box. So that's a prior categorization that now also requires a justification and can be asked the same question. Well, how do you know that that delineation criteria is correct? And thus ad infinitum. And that's why they don't like the ad infinitum problem, right? Remember in the Trent debate, Trent said, cogito ergo sum, it just is. It's just self-evident. Okay, well, can I just assert any self-evident principle? And he would say, no, it has to be consistent. Oh, so now you've added a second criteria for what it counts to be a self-evident principle. You see, he's starting now to rely on things that are not self-evident to justify the first principle that supposedly is self-evident. And if it's relying on other principles for its justification, then it is no longer self-evident. By definition, self-evidence means does not rely on other beliefs or propositions for its justification. And I even explained this in the debate with Trent. And none of the Roman Catholics seem to be able to grasp this point. In fact, none of the people I've debated seem to be able to grasp this point. I don't even think it's a very difficult, abstract point. I've asked this to Azra Rashid. I've asked it to Stefan Molyneux. I asked it to Matt Dillahunty. I asked it to T-Dump. I asked it to Trent Horn. I asked it to the Roman Catholic today in the Discord. He wanted to debate about, not Discord, Twitter. He wanted to debate about the papacy. And I said, well, can I ask you about the epistemic certitude that you have for the infallible papal statements? Where is the list? Well, there's not a list. Okay. How do you know that you have the certitude that you think you have as an individual Roman Catholic for parsing out the infallible and the non-infallible statements of the papacy? I said, what is your principle that you would apply to know that? I kid you not. He said, the papacy. That is a circular argument. Now, if you're a foundationalist, which inherently, by necessity, a Roman Catholic must be, because they have adopted a foundationalist epistemology, natural theology rests on this kind of a view. You can't make a circular argument, you see. So this is pointing out that this is a dead end either way they go. If they assert circular argumentation, then they're admitting my point about epistemic holism and webs of beliefs, and that reality and propositions and beliefs are theory-laden. And if they admit that, then they have to go in my direction. If, however, they think that their propositions are just simply self-evident, and then when I ask them why I should accept those self-evident principles, they start to give other reasons and criteria for that being self-evident, then they are no longer self-evident. And they are violating the notion of what self-evidence is, you see. Because it can't be an infinite regress. You can't just keep saying, well, this proposition is justified by this proposition, which is justified by this proposition, you see. And this, in fact, is why people moved out of strong foundationalism into what they call weak foundationalism, where they said, well, yeah, we can't really resolve that problem, so we'll just say that justified beliefs are the ones that have sufficient proof and evidence. Now, who is so naive as to think that that is itself a self-evident principle? Well, we all know what sufficient proof and evidence is, don't we? Do you see how silly and low IQ this reply is? It's again begging the question. Okay, what counts as sufficient proof and evidence without being arbitrary? Oh, well, when the data matches up to the facts. Again, begging the question, because that's not answering the criterion problem. Right. Do you guys see this? Given the problems, Manion goes on to say, discussed thus far, many contemporary philosophers such as Nietzsche, Quine, Rorty, Unger, Harman, Lehrer, and others became skeptics as to the possibility of objective truth. According to Richard Boyd, the consensus among philosophers of science is that foundationalist conceptions of knowledge in general and of scientific knowledge in particular are untenable. Exactly. Now, I'm not saying it's true because this guy said it. He's just expressing the contemporary attitude. Yeah, exactly. When you're a secular atheist academic and you're honest with yourself, you're going to realize that this whole schema doesn't work. It's a dead end, a failed enterprise. And if you give up on justification, then you give up debate. You give up the possibility of arguing and proving Christianity false, atheists. So bite the bullet if you're going to give up your foundationalist enterprise. Then you have to drop the microphone. You have nothing to say into the microphone against the Christian. You have no argument at all. There is no argument at all. There is no argumentation at all, because argumentation presupposes logic, universality, induction, deduction, abstract entities, etc., etc., etc. To quote West Side Story. I'm just joking, by the way. All right, if you would hit like and share, we're getting deeper and deeper into the Russ Manion paper. Now, Father Deacon Dr. Ananias also has an excellent paper going even deeper into this justification quagmire in regard to Quine. Because as you guys know, we lectured through Quine's two dogmas a couple times in the last few weeks. And we need to get Father Deacon back on here because his critique of Quine is an even deeper investigation into this topic. It's even better because, as we know, Quine just basically says, look, we got to give up this whole idea of self-evidence, foundationalism, and starting points, right? We saw throughout the two dogmas that Quine has the circle, right? The circle just shows that whenever we start talking about what is analyticity ends up being definitions of words. Definitions of words end up being explained by people who do write dictionaries, lexicographers, and they end up telling us what it is by definition, right? And that ends up being so it's a big circle, right? Remember that from the Quine lectures. It just resulted in a circle. And so these things result in a circle, then it begs the question for an empiricist. And remember, the logical positivists, and he chose Carnap as his example, they're empiricists, okay? They are super duper empiricists. It's pure sense data, okay? Now, if you're an empiricist and you wanted to maintain the validity of logic, math, and these things, science and so forth, on the basis of the analytic-synthetic distinction, then Quine's paper showed that actually this all breaks down, right? On empiricist grounds, there's not a basis for the analytic-synthetic distinction. It breaks down. And that's what his paper demonstrates. And again, it's all just reasserting the various arguments of Hume and Kant. And that does not mean that we adopt Hume and Kant's philosophy or worldview. Now, a lot more could be said, too, about Manion's paper. But what I wanted to talk about, and we could go back into some of these other points in Manion's paper on the page before this was really cool. It's a really excellent, it's again, I think still the best introduction to the transcendental argument. So if people are looking for it, in the Discord we have the Contingency of Knowledge paper. And he talks about, I think we should go back to the foundationalist section here. That might actually be good. But why am I doing all this? Why am I talking about who cares about this boring philosophy stuff? Well, because of this. The whole point of the transcendental argument is to point you to this. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and fools despise wisdom instruction. So biblical epistemology, revelational epistemology, which Father Deacon argues for very well in his paper, is making the argument that we're not going to be able to construct a human system that will resolve or solve the perennial questions of philosophy, and especially the last 500 years of epistemology. That's the point. That the paradigm as a whole of non-believing, non-Christian worldviews are subject to devolution and digression into these boxes of contradiction and unsolvable dilemmas that are so contradictory, not just that they're wrong, but they actually make knowledge impossible. That is the argument. That's the strength of the transcendental argument, is that you must begin your reasoning with the fear of the Lord. And if you don't have that, it doesn't mean that everything you believe is wrong. It means, to translate it into philosophical language, you can't give an account for it. So you can tell me all day long about how you believe in teleology and causation, and you love Plato, and you love Aristotle's first mover, and blah, 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 blah. And that's all well and good. But all I have to do is ask you David Hume's questions. And you can tell me that you think Hume is incoherent, and I would agree with you that his worldview is false. But how do you answer his objections on causation, induction, deduction, regulative nature, etc., on your view? How many times have we repeated the peripatetic axiom? There is nothing in the intellect that is not first in the senses. Okay. How am I supposed to know that that's the truth, or accept that as a first principle, when that first principle itself is not in sense data and violates its own principle? Does that mean that I don't believe in sense data? No. I'm just questioning your jump start, your starting point. Okay. So we got a lot of slow boys out there who can't follow this point. Okay. We're not affirming skepticism. And by the way, me using an argument from David Hume does not make me a Humean atheist any more than Roman Catholics using Aristotle and first cause makes them Aristotelians. If I use an argument from Van Til, it doesn't make me a Calvinist. Okay? Do people not understand this? That people's arguments are different than the person making the argument? And by the way, that's called the genetic fallacy. So the people out here rambling, they don't even know what the fallacies are. Oh, that argument is false because it comes from an atheist, David Hume. Genetic fallacy. Why are you bringing fallacies to me? Literally, we had 3 people today making this making this genetic fallacy. And the other reason why, from the Orthodox or the Christian perspective, that we would have to disagree with, like, the Roman Catholic approach to these issues, right, is that we don't think that man's reasoning faculty is undamaged by the fall. So if you remember in Father Deacon's paper for the Transcendental Argument, he begins by quoting John Paul II's famous encyclical Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason. And John Paul has the famous quote, which clearly expresses the Catholic tradition, that for them, natural philosophy, natural theology operates on the assumption that man's reasoning capabilities are autonomous. Clear as day, word for word what he says. When I sent the debate proposal to Trent, I said that proposition from John Paul II in his encyclical is what I want to debate. And that is what we debated. That's not what Trent debated. Trent did not debate that. Trent debated and conflated multiple issues: natural law, moral law, logic and logical probabilities and logical truths. Okay, none of those things are the equivalent of autonomous natural theology. Okay, those are all different things. But as we've seen, of course, many Roman Catholics say that because we operate on a sort of a bait and switch model, right? So we're all using the same words, so we all obviously mean the same things, right? What does E. Michael Jones say? Logos. The logos of Plato is the same logos as the Aristotle, and that's the logos of John 1. Logos of John 1 is the same logos. No, it's not. That's so inanely wrong-headed, I don't even know how to make this point. Do you think that Aristotle, when he thought about logos, when Marcus Aurelius thought about logos, was he intending the historical person Jesus Christ? No. Was he intending the Trinity? No. Was he intending the second person of the Godhead? No. Okay, so the words do not mean or have the same referent. I do not understand why Roman Catholics cannot understand this. It's not an advanced issue. It's not a technical issue. It's a very simple word reference issue. The word logos has varying and different meanings in different contexts and systems. Like, why is that hard to understand or accept? Okay. So no, John in John 1 does not mean what Aristotle and Plato mean by logos. There might be some overlap, but some overlap does not equate to same referent. And you can show that logically, as the Garrity paper does very clearly, very obviously. All right, if you would hit like and share. We do have open forum. You can submit your questions, your Q&A. The pagans today said that this is all OnlyFans. So what I do is the equivalent of OnlyFans. We don't actually get into anything of any substance here. It's me just yelling and dunking on people. Really? Does anybody think that exposition of this excellent paper is the equivalent of OnlyFans? Really? Well, that's the level to which these people have been reduced by their paganism. So let's see here. And I don't even know. So some of them were like, well, I'm not a pagan. I'm a Catholic. Same difference for me, dude. Because the way you guys act is just unbelievable, really. It's off the charts. All right. I'm going to open up the Q&A, and we're over here on the Twitter Spaces still, so it's still open forum. So if somebody wants to speak, you can. We've got multiple people requesting to speak. Charlie, what's up, Charlie? You have the mic. Charlie has the mic. And by the way, I'm going to have to plug my computer in because it's about to die. Go ahead, Charlie. Charlie, are you there? Do you want to speak? All right. Well, if Charlie's not going to speak, we'll go to Edvin. Go ahead, Edvin.
Way to tell you.
What do you want to tell me?
Oh yeah, my name is Yaya. I'm from the Gambia, smiling coast of West Africa. I'm living with my grandma and my siblings. I lost my both parents. They have a fire accident and they all died there. I'm the one take care of my siblings and my grandma. But
yeah, sorry about that. We're not here to take donations, and I'm not trying to be mean to you, but I have no way to verify that you are who you say you are, or that your donations are going to go to your siblings. So, sorry about that. Who's next? Let's see. All right, so it's open forum, guys, and Father Deacon, welcome. I know you said you probably couldn't speak. You're welcome to come on and speak if you'd like to. We got a couple super chats I'll read real quick. Orthodox Hungarian says for $5, is Descartes' argument about the cogito circular, and is circularity a problem for some arguments and not for others? Yes. So Descartes' cogito is circular, but the problem is that Descartes is kind of the arch big daddy of foundationalism. So in epistemology, you have this idea of strong foundationalism, and the idea is let's search for the most certain, totally indubitable starting point principle to build a philosophy from. So if you read the Meditations, right, that's what Descartes' after. And he does this sort of whittling down, boiling down position, and he thinks he's come to what is the self-evident, indubitable starting point, right, which is the cogito. But the problem is that, as again many philosophers after that have shown with a good bit of ease, it's not very difficult, especially Kant, the cogito isn't actually an indubitable starting point. In fact, it assumes all kinds of things. It assumes that words have meaning. It assumes an epistemology. It assumes that it assumes time determination, right? When you say occurrence, things occurring refers to time determinants. And so Kant says that, well, Descartes, you're questioning things, but you didn't question time. So you want to find the most indubitable starting point. You want to question everything, but you didn't question language, time. I mean, there's all these things and it's also a non sequitur, right? The fact that there's an occurring or a thinking, I think some philosophers have said if you wanted to argue it, really all it would be arguing is that thinking is occurring. Okay, the fact that there's thinking doesn't necessarily give you, especially in terms of a jump start, right? In terms of the jump start critique of Manion, the fact that thinking is occurring, that doesn't prove you that you're a self. Okay, what do you even mean by I? I think, therefore I am. I mean, maybe you're a self, but you can't cheat Descartes. And if you're going to say I'm looking for the indubitable self-evident starting point, you can't rely on all these other principles and say, oh, yeah, well, see, all those things are also self-evident. That's cheating on your own grounds, you see. So it's no longer a self-evident, indubitable starting point if it requires all of these other metaphysical principles, language, meaning, the self, time determination, logical entailment. Do you see how that doesn't work? So then you said, well, what about other questions that are circular, right? That's why we're arguing that at a meta level, meta ethics, meta epistemology, meta logic, the questions become circular. And that's what I was intending to address. And actually in the sections of the Manion paper that we read, we did address that. Because Manion's point was that, isn't it obvious from all of these disputes and dead ends in epistemology that there isn't a foundationalist out? Scientism, empiricism, classical theism are empiricist enterprises. And if you're going to be an empiricist, as the beginning point of your epistemology, which I pointed out to Trent, if you're going to have the peripatetic axiom, which Aquinas does, there's nothing in the intellect that's not first in the senses, then you're going to have to be consistent with that. And all we're doing is we're calling the Thomist to the exact consistency that we're calling Descartes to. They have different approaches and different systems, but they're both foundationalist. Totally. And let's make another point that always trips people up. Saying that a belief is foundational to another belief does not mean that you're a foundationalist. Those are different things. So I believe the transcendental categories are foundational to the possibility of beliefs or knowledge at all. That doesn't make me a foundationalist. Two totally different things. Because foundationalists are not epistemic holists. They do not believe that our worldviews function like a web of beliefs. They think there are self-evident, indubitable principles, maxims etc., things that are doxastically basic. And so we're just simply saying, on what basis are we supposed to know or accept your list of doxastic basicality? So let's take an example. Let's say let's say a Roman Catholic comes and says, all right, I'm ready to refute you. I have my list of doxastically basic principles. And so let's say he lists 10 things. Okay. Blah, 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 and blah, 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 blah. Okay. So you have a list. Now, the way I like to make this argument, to just make it really easy, Father Deacon has papers where he gets really, really in depth in this. He kind of goes like super formal logic with it. And you can go that route too to show this, but let's make it really easy here. Okay, so wait a minute, Mr. Roman Catholic. You've got a list of 10 things that you said are properly basic. Does that also mean that there's a whole bunch of other beliefs that might be in a separate category or might be based on those 10 things that are not properly basic? Yes, correct. Anything that is not based in sufficient proof and evidence on the 10 principles is not properly basic, but based on the properly basics. Okay. All right. So now you have a delineation problem, because now you have another criteria, right, above the 10 things that you listed, which is a principle by which you know for sure to delineate and put them into the different bins, you see. Do you see how that's a higher separate question? Because now he has a epistemic principle by which not only does he assert the 10 properly basic things, he also says, and I also therefore know by a higher principle all of the other things to not put in the 10 bin, you see. So all you have to do is keep raising the bar and keep asking, okay, well, doesn't this rely on this other principle? And you see the problem for the foundationalist. If the positions keep relying on or referring to other principles, then he's no longer believing in self-evident principles. King is dead. What's up, dude? You got the mic. King is dead on the mic.
Good evening. Thank you for giving me the microphone. I appreciate that. I know the listeners, they're all knowledgeable. You're knowledgeable. I like to basically learn from you guys. I have only one question that could be a stupid one
That's okay. What's up?
In this session of experts, but I like to ask that. I spent some amount of time reading Socrates from the world of Plato, and also a number of other philosophers, for example, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, other folks. And then ended up being depressed. Kierkegaard especially. I was fond of Kierkegaard for years, and now I'm trying to stay away from him. Now, then it came, Stephen Hawkins came with the idea that, listen, the philosophy is not going to solve anything from a human being, and we only need to rely on science.
Sure.
That's what Stephen Hawking said. So I wanted to know the idea of you and your expert panel as to what it is, why the philosophy, if it is good, why make some people depressed, and isn't it better that we leave it all and go for science, as Hawking said? That's my question.
Right. Well, science is not going to fare any better in that question, because science doesn't give us any moral values or standards, right? This is the classic point that Hume makes, which is that you can't get an ought from an is. All science can tell you is, in limited degrees, maybe what is the case or how something works, but none of that can give you aesthetic judgments, values, right and wrong, good and bad. Right? Those are all the domain of ethics and metaphysics. So science is very limited in what it can do. It's merely, I would say science is just a tool for understanding the natural world. So how can a tool, it'd be like saying, I have a screwdriver. It's a tool. The screwdriver is the answer to all of man's ills. Well, I'm sorry, but you can put the screwdriver up on a totem and worship it. It's not gonna solve the hole in man's heart. And so that's why it's not the problem of philosophy. It's a problem of atheistic, materialist, secular, heathen, autonomous philosophies. Those are the philosophies that are empty and leave man without meaning because they don't have God. That's the whole point. And the point of the argument that I'm making today is that all of the world's secular philosophers and great thinkers, not that they don't have insights or that they don't say true things, but that they can't give man meaning and what man is looking for because they're empty, because they are dead ends. So man needs more than just a system. He needs more than just some blank philosophy. He needs more than just a bunch of test tubes and science facts and lab rats, right? Man needs, and he needs more than just pleasure points, right? Maybe science can give you the greatest potential orgasm, and you can just keep through a brain control microchip, right? And these were real experiments, by the way. Like part of MKUltra experimented with this kind of stuff where, give me a brain chip that will cause me to basically have an orgasm every time somebody pushes a button. Well, guess what? Do you think that's going to make man and his happy in his life to just be in a cocoon pod? No, because these aren't the things that man was made for. Man was made for God, and as St. Augustine says, man was made for God, and until our heart finds rest in thee, we are restless. So we're going to be restless until we find rest in God. That's the whole point of everything I'm saying today.
Thank you. That is another issue of mine. I've also spent some time believing, when I say sometimes, this 20 years believing and then ending up thinking that there is nobody out there who can look after human beings, look at history, look at all the bad things that happen, and as soon as we start believing it is just the interpretation of all the bad things that happens around us, and we keep interpreting it. Yes, this was a test by God. That was another test by God. Eventually, it's going to be good. Eventually, what it is that we are really left alone. We are alone in this universe, and there is. It would have been good. It would have been whether it's better to have somebody to believe in, or whether we can be wondered by just being alone. That's another thing. But
okay, well, this sounds like, so it sounds like a lot of existentialist kind of musings and whatnot, which I'm not knocking you for, but the way that I'm approaching this argument and this position, this point, is to put it this way: if there is no God, you couldn't have any knowledge at all. You would have no justification or basis for the possibility of knowledge. So in other words, if God doesn't exist, you can't make sentences. That's my argument. So if you don't, so you need to bite the bullet, is what I'm saying. So
yes. No, I think I no, this is a very important one. That's where the meaning comes from. You're saying at the same time, the evolutionary theory is saying different things.
Yeah, and my point is that if you adopt those views and you're consistent with them, they will make the possibility of knowledge impossible. And so they're self-refuting. That's the point.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Now, I'm not trying to cut you off, but I'm saying that was the point of the whole discussion today. So I know that you may not have heard or listened to earlier what we were discussing or talking about, but that was kind of the point of the discussion today. Brandon, what's up, Brandon? Let's go, Brandon.
Yo.
What's up, man?
Yeah, that whole conversation just kind of threw me off for a second. I was just, we're not all experts here. We're not all learned people. I took 12 years in That was a long time ago. Theology, correct? So we're not all scholars here, but I like coming and just listening. I need a dictionary for half of it. You know what I mean? I don't know all the words that you use, but I have a question on like the Immaculate Conception.
Okay.
So you as Orthodox, you don't believe in that, right?
I think it's bound up with a Roman Catholic anthropology and the Roman Catholic acceptance of most of the Augustinian views, and so I would say no, we don't really believe that for various reasons.
Okay. Oh, so I mean that's in the Bible, though. I mean, right? Like.
No, I don't think there's any place in the Bible that teaches that Mary was immaculately conceived. Where do you think that's in the Bible? I mean, I'm not trying to be rude or call you out, but what do you think teaches that?
Well, Saint Gabriel came down. She was a virgin, correct? I mean, he came down and said she's going to bear the son.
That's the virgin birth. The Immaculate Conception is the idea that Mary was not subject to original sin. That's a different thing.
Oh, that's a whole different thing, huh?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
So one more time. So you don't believe in what just like elaborate on it one more time for me.
Sorry. So the virgin birth is when Gabriel appears and says, right. That's the Annunciation. The Immaculate Conception is a Roman Catholic dogma that Mary also, when she was conceived, was born without original sin.
Oh, okay.
And we don't believe that.
It's been a long time.
That's okay.
I mean? It's been a long time.
Right. Yeah. Well, good questions, dude. Let's see. Let's move on here. Noctua? What's up, Noctua? Just unmute if you want to speak. And by the way, we're going to go back here to the Manion paper and look at his critique of foundationalism, because it's excellent, right? And hopefully this will help with future discussions and disputes. So if we get Roman Catholics and Protestants and atheists in debates that are foundationalists and well, I don't understand your point. Well, what is your argument? You're crazy. I'm going to refer them to this stream from now on. Be like, okay, so you want this critique? Because, I mean, after like the 5th time this week of hearing the response that self-evident principles are just self-evident, and that justification is achieved for first principles by saying that I can't see how it's otherwise. I'm done. I can't hear this anymore. I'm so tired of this objection. We've been hearing it for I don't know how long. This was Timothy Gordon's response 2 years ago. He was like, "It's a justification if I say that I can't see it's any other way." I mean, all right, whatever, dude. Did you want to talk? Noctua?
Oh, hey, J. Dyer.
What's up?
Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
This is my first time speaking on space, so my speech may not be as fluid as we'd like it to be, but
that's okay.
Bear with me. I have a question about, actually, would you mind if I play devil's advocate with Descartes?
No.
On that same vein of when he's questioning, whittling down the things,
right.
Going all the way to the foundational level of questioning, how is it possible that when he's questioning, he reaches to such a point that he questions his own consciousness and, let's say, actually realizes that the questioning process of his own consciousness is actually self-evident. In other words, to question his own consciousness, he would presuppose his own consciousness.
Right.
And in this way, it would be self-evident.
Right. That's his argument, yes.
That's what he was giving?
Correct.
And do you think that's valid?
No, for all, and I'm not saying this to be mean, but for all the reasons that I just said about 5 minutes ago, no, it doesn't follow.
Even if the presupposition is with all that baggage that you just stated, right?
Well, the baggage is the problem. You see, it can't be self-evident if it relies on a bunch of baggage.
Okay. Because they're not self-evident. Yeah.
Correct. Exactly.
And on that same line of, let's take Descartes of dualism. I have another question. How do you think that there can be interaction between our soul, which is immaterial, and our body that is material?
Well, we don't, as an Orthodox person, we have a holistic anthropology. So we don't have a body-soul dualism of Descartes. And Descartes actually defined these things as in a kind of opposition. So he talked about the immaterial substance, the soul kind of being the opposite of the bodily substance. And so that's why he posited, pineal gland somehow as the bridge, but it's just a bunch of weird stuff. But we don't have that. That's a feature of Western dialectical philosophy, a body-soul dualism that is the inheritance of the Augustinian tradition. So the Orthodox tradition is that man is a holist entity, right? Body and soul are not two separate substances that are defined in contradistinction to one another. They're always and forever intended to be united together. And so that's why the resurrection is so important for us, because we believe that God never intended the soul to be separate from the body, which is what death is, the severance of the soul from the body. Death is an unnatural state for the Orthodox. But for the Western and Augustinian tradition, especially into the medieval Latin era, you get a really strict body-soul dualism, and the idea ultimately that the soul is kind of like this thing that needs to escape the body. I mean, that's kind of what underlies a lot of Roman Catholic asceticism and bodily mortification and bodily punishment and this kind of stuff. I think that's foreign to the idea of the goodness of the body inherently. Certainly the soul is a higher faculty and function than the body in terms of our anthropology. It should govern the body, but that doesn't make the body evil, bad, or something that we need to punish or dispense with. So I think that underlying the whole approach of Descartes is a kind of Gnostic, Platonic approach, which we fundamentally reject. I mean, this is precisely why the Greeks couldn't fathom the doctrine of the resurrection. And we're going to look at this in a minute. We're going to go back to Acts 17. I'm going to show you that Paul doesn't do Roman Catholic apologetics in Acts 17. In fact, he does the very opposite of it. You see him doing what I do. And that, I think, is a really strong attestation to the, just lost off in the weeds Roman Catholic natural theology approach. But do you see how this relates to anthropology as well? Like, we don't have Roman Catholic anthropology. And Descartes, remember, he's coming out of a Jesuit tradition. So his anthropology is totally influenced by, the extremes of the Latin tradition.
Well, I can see how the anthropology fits, but I don't see how the soul, which is immaterial, fits together with the material body.
Well, because it's a both and. So hold on.
Material?
Well, so if you look at the Church Fathers, when Cyril talks about henosis, St. Cyril uses this analogy for Christology. He says that in the same way that the divine nature interpenetrates and is fully present in the human nature in the incarnation in Christ, so in the same way, the soul fully interpenetrates and is present in the body. So the only reason that would be a problem is if you have the assumption of Western dialectics. And Orthodox Christianity, from the outset, fundamentally rejects Western dialectical opposition. Okay, again, let's make this clear for the people who always get confused over this. I'm not talking about dialectics in terms of pedagogy. I'm talking about metaphysical dialectics, that something is the opposite of another thing that's in the created realm or right. So the body is not the opposite of the soul. The body was made to be the house of the soul and to be filled with the soul in the same way as Christ's two natures interpenetrate one another without dissolution and without destruction of the natural properties of both natures. That's St. Cyril's analogy of the soul and the body to Christ's two natures.
So you guys reject Plato's proposition that when there is, for example, hot, cold must leave the same place that hot is in terms of opposites?
So that's a different type of opposites. That's a different type of opposition or opposite. So opposite is not the same thing as dialectical opposition. right? So, for example, in a lot of Hellenic philosophy, there's a dialectical tension, a natural antipathy between the one and the many. There's a dialectical tension between stasis and change. Those are cashed out as dialectically opposite, for example, in Aristotle or Plato. And so, for example,
and the soul is not in that dialectical opposition with
correct.
the material?
Correct. We are Orthodox Christians, not Platonists. We are not Platonists. In fact, Platonism on these points is actually condemned in the Synodicon. And Aristotle,
okay.
too.
So the substance of the soul is of a different kind than
yeah, but God can create different kinds of things that aren't naturally or inherently in tension or opposite one another. In other words, let me put it this way. Hellenic metaphysics is based on dialectical opposition, and we don't believe that. We don't accept that. We don't accept Western dialectics.
It's not a totalizing factor, okay?
Well, if you look at the heretics in the councils, pretty much every heretic, whether it's Nestorius or Eunomius or Arius or especially Pyrrhus, when Maximus debates Pyrrhus, you'll notice that they always come back to these points in their argumentation. Well, it's either this or this. Either God's one or he's many. Either God is simple or Jesus is a creature, right? And so all of these heretics are forced into these metaphysical dialectical assumptions, and the church fathers are consistently saying it's not an either or. God is not only one and in no sense distinct. Eunomians, right? There's not a look. Let me give you some other. Let me give you a couple other examples of this. Maybe it'll help. Protestants, for example, classical Protestants, right? They think there's a tension between the will of man and the will of God. There is no natural tension between the will of man and God. We don't believe that. There's no natural tension between grace and free will. There's no natural tension between the church and the Bible, right? Protestants will set the church against the Bible. Faith versus works. Those are all silly dialectical false oppositions from our view.
Which are based on natural theology?
Well, they're based on metaphysical assumptions in the case of the Greeks, right? If you read Plato, let's take Aristotle, right? So if you read Bradshaw's book, Aristotle, East and West, he has a really good critique where he points out in the first few chapters about Aristotle that Aristotle thinks that unity is better than multiplicity. And that's a metaphysical assumption that Aristotle just takes to be the case. And we don't believe that. God is just as much one as he is three. It's not like, but God's unity is better, right? And threeness is like lesser status, right? So it's a ontologically diminished status. Aristotle says that stasis is better, quote unquote, than change. Oh, why? I mean, that's why Maximus has this whole debate where he says that God transcends the dialectic of stasis and change, because God can do different things. He can do both things, you see.
I get it.
Okay.
Yeah, that seems much less limiting.
Exactly. All right.
Thanks, Vic.
Yeah, great questions. All right, so it's open forum if anybody wants to bring up some issues. Let's see. Did you want to say something else, Noctva? And then we'll go back to the Manion paper on foundationalism. Did you want to say something else? Oh, he's connecting. All right, well, maybe try again because it won't let you connect here in a little bit. All right, so let's look at this is not too long either. Let's look at Manion's section on foundationalism and his excellent, just super lucid, super clear, super easy to understand critique of foundationalism. And he says here, those who follow Kant's lead, now he's giving us kind of a moving up through the history of philosophy here, and he's getting up to human Kant. He says, those who follow Kant's lead gave up trying to describe the world as it actually is, because they realized that all the traditional rational and empirical epistemologies and conceptions of science share a similar underlying structure. They are all foundationalistic. they realized that all the beliefs could be divided into two categories: beliefs that are justified by referring to other beliefs, and beliefs that are not subject to justification, which are the foundations of those beliefs. Okay, do you remember me saying this a minute ago with the Roman Catholic? Right, this is it. Right? Remember the Roman Catholic test case guy who said there are 10 foundational self-evident beliefs, and then there's these other ones that are built on that. Well, that's a prior criterion for him to cash those out as either or in those two categories. Okay, but there's no justification for the prior category that's assumed there, you see. And Manion is saying the same thing here. The challenge here, of course, are these foundational beliefs. Rationalists thought that their innate self-evident a priori beliefs were the best candidates. Now, think of Descartes here, right? Descartes is the preeminent rationalist foundationalist, but not every foundationalist is a rationalist. Many foundationalists are Humean empiricists or atheistic scientistic materialists, okay? So foundationalism nowadays typically encompasses, it's 99% foundationalists are this sort of in the Humean empiricist tradition, right? The positivists and so forth, Vienna School. Every now and then you might find a person who affirms Platonism or some form of Aristotelianism. Those people are there in academia here and there, and they would be foundationalists, but they might be, especially if they're Platonists, they would be a rationalist type of foundationalist. Okay, so just making that clear. And that's why so I could be I could be Thomas Aquinas and have a more empiricist bent to my foundationalism, or I could be Descartes and have a more rationalist bent to my foundationalism. Okay, so any of those can be foundationalist in their approaches. So he says, rationalists thought that their innate self-evident a priori beliefs were the best candidates for grounding their knowledge, what he's saying. And empiricists thought that their sense data impressions were the best candidates. But this discussion has never been advanced beyond Hume. Do you hear me make this point all the time? Have you guys not heard me make this argument at this point 100 times probably? In epistemology, this is still the fundamental issue. And this itself is a kind of a bizarre swinging back and forth for the unbelieving paradigm for philosophers. You have philosophers that are extremely rationalistic, like Hegel. I mean, Hegel would be even more, maybe equally as rationalist as Descartes, right? The real is the rational is the real for Hegel. Okay, that's an extreme rationalism. And for the opposite side, it's not rationalism and reasoning. It's pure, raw sense data. Okay, what did we just hear from Sam Harris the other day when we critiqued his Jordan Peterson podcast appearance? Right, the exact opposite. So if I were to try to think of people today, I don't actually know any hardcore Platonists, but if we had a hardcore Platonist come on who wanted to defend Platonism, he might fall into the category of, or a Hegelian, of a foundationalist, rationalist, perhaps. I don't know. I'm just trying to think of who in the modern philosophical world might approximate something like that. And then the opposite position would be anybody from T. Jump to Trent Horn to any kind of empirical based foundationalism. And the reason I said even though Trent used Descartes as a Thomist, Trent falls more in line with the empiricist tradition, because Thomas Aquinas was clearly more of an empiricist in the sense of the peripatetic axiom, right? Aquinas accepts the peripatetic axiom and says there's nothing in the intellect that's not first in the senses. Okay, well, that's definitely more in the empiricist tradition. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't rationalist elements in Aquinas, by the way. So I'm not saying that either, because Aquinas obviously is very influenced by Dionysius. All right. So then Manion goes on to say, the challenge, let's see. This discussion has never advanced beyond Hume, and we should in fact recognize that this is a problem beyond resolution if the object of knowledge is to be the world. And so remember, all of these systems and all of these approaches are trying to ground man's epistemology for knowing and doing things in the world, right? Science, scientific endeavors, they involve manipulating the world, doing things in the world. Engineering, right, involves doing things in the external world. But the question that we're asking in epistemology is, how do we justify our beliefs, our foundational knowledge criterion? Aristotle had already pointed out long ago that our options regarding first truths, self-evident maxims, principles, doxastically basic beliefs, foundations, they are very limited. Okay, this is the point, right? This question has been the same, kind of, from Aristotle all the way up to Aquinas. And this is the same question that Manion is asking of Aristotle, is the same question that I asked of Trent Horn. When asked to justify why we ultimately believe something, we will either give an answer or we will not. If we give an answer, so notice he's cashing this out in a bunch of either-ors, which is excellent for the purpose of rhetoric and debate. If we do not give an answer, our belief is arbitrary or fideistic. Remember the atheist guy in the chat today? What did he say? Well, I don't know. I know that I don't know anything. And that's my first foundational belief. Okay. So that falls into the point Manion is making right here, right? His starting point belief is either arbitrary or fideistic. If we do give an answer, then our answer will make reference to some other belief or beliefs. Okay? You guys have heard me saying this throughout today's open forum, that this is the criterion problem. You have a list of the beliefs that you think are self-evident or basic. How do you know that? Oh, well, because it couldn't be otherwise. Oh, well, because it's self-evident. Oh, because of this. Okay. When we were asked to justify those beliefs and so on, in the course of our justifying, we refer oftentimes, he's saying, to some belief that we have already been asked to justify. How many times have we seen this today? Now, let me get you guys the screenshot of the next section, because he keeps going here. You can only fit so much of this on the Streamlabs here. All right, I think this is the right screenshot. Yeah, this is it. Okay. So there's not a whole lot more to this, so don't worry, I'm not going to be reading forever. But so here's the next section. All right, he goes on to say, when we are asked to justify our first beliefs, we will be involved in circular reasoning. If we never refer back to a belief that we've been asked to justify, then we will be involved in an infinite regress. Now, if you paid attention in the Trent debate, both of these things happened. At one point, Trent started going in the infinite regress and justifying his foundational beliefs on other beliefs, and thus making the first beliefs not foundational or self-evident. That would be the infinite regress problem. However, if he thinks that it's self-evident and it's self-evident because we know it's self-evident, that would be circularity, and he would no longer be a foundationalist. None of these replies are satisfactory. A fideistic belief is, by definition, unjustified, and it does not differ epistemologically from its antithesis. Now, this is a great point that we bring up often. Why is this such an important point? Well, remember, if in the process or context of a debate, somebody says, well, my first principles aren't justified, it's just kind of like you just have to start somewhere, man, right? Well, if they're not justified, then I can just as well bring to the debate the opposite of that as my starting point. And there's no way to delineate epistemically which one is correct and which one is false. Because if you start saying the other one is false, then you are no longer you're no longer a fideist about your starting points. If we think it does have an epistemic advantage over its antithesis, then the advantage will be used as a justification. But at that point, we are on our way to circularity or an infinite regress. And again, that's what no foundationalist can admit. An infinite regress is not satisfactory. To say that the justification for a given belief finally comes at the end of an unending series of beliefs is simply to obfuscate the fact that the belief in question is never justified. Exactly. Consequently, an infinite regress is not just another fideistic belief and suffers from the same fate. Do you guys understand this? Is this clear? What about just pure circularity? Maybe self-evident beliefs are just circular and they are self-referencing. Now, we're not talking about in the Christian paradigm, right? We're talking about critiquing the foundationalist system. What if a foundationalist says, oh, okay, then now I affirm circularity? Do I escape the problem as a foundationalist by merely referring to or accepting circularity? Well, this is not satisfactory, Manion says, but it is more interesting. Advocates of a philosophical position called coherentism think that they have beaten the foundational dilemma. They point out that beliefs do not neatly divide into the categories of foundational and justified. All of our beliefs are related to one another in the form of a coherent web, right? Now, Manion is bringing in here the response to foundationalists that coherentists have. And they have this because they are recognizing the circularity of these starting points. Does that mean, again, let's avoid confusion because people always get confused over this too. Does that mean that I am affirming a secular coherentist view of epistemology because I'm using this argument? No. So remember, guys, a lot of confusion is generated out there by people thinking that to use an argument from a system or from a school or from a philosopher entails that you believe that system or that philosopher's worldview. It does not. If I use an argument from the forms or from the realm of the ideas, that does not make me an idealist. If I make an argument from empirical sense data, that does not make me an empiricist. If I make an argument from, I don't know, what else is there? If I think Hegel made a good argument about this or that, does that make me a Hegelian, right? No, of course not. If I make an argument from Van Til, does that make me a reformed Van Tilian? Not necessarily. So remember, let's not confuse arguments with the people who make the arguments. You can pull out an argument in terms of its form, and that is irrespective and irrelevant to the person or the individual who made the argument. I can't believe that people don't see this, especially these pagans or these neo-pagans or whoever they are, think that you can't make an argument about logic without assuming that it's the property of Aristotle. Okay. The justification for why logic is true is not by saying, well, Aristotle said it. Okay, pagans, do you understand that? That's an appeal to authority. Okay. They may be authorities, but they don't make the position true because they're eminent wise sages. Okay. Eminent wise sages don't make a position true. They might help your case. You can bring in authorities to attest to the truth of your position. Okay. Remember when T-Dump did this? He did the exact same thing. He said it's true because the scientists say it's true. Really? Your principle of epistemology is scientific consensus. Number one, I don't think you actually can get scientific consensus. Number two, that doesn't give you epistemic certitude or any epistemic criteria. Number three, it's a fallacy. You can't get epistemic certitude from a consensus of people. How could a fallacy be a consensus? So remember, there's people on the internet who they think they're really smart and they're being really super sophisticated when they're like, actually, you can't appeal to authorities. It's not a fallacy. Well, it may be and it may not be. It depends on what you're trying to prove. And the usage of it by T-Dump in our so-called debate was a fallacy because I was asking him for a justification for his epistemic principles. And his justification was because the scientists say so. Okay. So he combined, and he said most of the scientists say so. So he combined appeal to masses and appeal to authority fallacy, as if that could grant epistemic justification for his knowledge criteria. So he didn't even understand what question was being asked, right? So when appeal to authority is and isn't a fallacy depends upon the case in question. Think about in a courtroom. in a courtroom, not everybody has expertise in ballistics, in, DNA, blah, blah, blah. So what do? They bring in experts to give expert testimony. Does expert testimony mean necessarily that the person is guilty? Of course not. It's an evidence. It's an attestation. It's something that speaks to the case or to the point. But it cannot function in a logical entailment way, a formal way, as proof. And I hope everybody sees this, because it's actually a really simple point. But apparently a lot of people think that Platonism is true because Plato said it. I mean, I literally heard a pagan, one of the most famous neo-pagans out there, dialoguing with my friend when we're trying to set up a debate. And I'm not joking, his reply was, Platonism and the gods are the case because Plato and Aristotle said so. And who are you to challenge those eminent wise sages? I really hope that guy does come debate, because that will be a cakewalk if that's his epistemic principle. I mean, so I can just throw up any other wise old sage, right? Do you see how this is just a ridiculous argument? All right, so let's get back to Manion. Manion says, this point of circularity and coherence isn't going to work, because even though it's an insightful critique of the foundationalist system or approach, let's see why it also fails ultimately. And this again needs to be said, because still everybody out there thinks that we are coherentists. Oh, you're not a foundationalist. Oh, you're a coherence theory of truth guy. I could easily refute you. Did I ever say I affirmed the secular coherence view of epistemology? No. All we're doing is saying they have an insight and a good critique of the foundationalists. All of our beliefs are related to one another in a form of a coherent web. I agree with that. That is an excellent insight to move us in the direction of what we could call epistemic holism. Some subset of our beliefs may be more important and juridical to other beliefs, but all of our beliefs hang or fall on other beliefs, and thus the coherentist argues nothing is actually foundational per se, or foundational in the sense of self-evident. Okay, again, doesn't mean that I can't use the term foundational as if some beliefs are foundational to other beliefs. Sure, right? And did you notice that Manion says that right there? That's the very point you hear me making all the time. Sure, you could say that some beliefs are foundational to other beliefs. The transcendental categories are foundational to the possibility of knowledge or beliefs, but that does not entail foundationalism. And even Trent didn't grasp that. But as Michael DePaul says in his article on coherentism, as he points out, coherentism doesn't really escape the foundational problem at all. It is actually another version of foundationalism that holds that all beliefs are foundational. He says regarding the coherentist solution of the problem of circularity, quote, but coherentism seems to be a non-starter. For if no belief in the chain is justified to begin with, then there is nothing to pass along. Altering the metaphor, we might say that coherentism seems about as likely to succeed as a bucket brigade does, not at the end of a well, but simply moves around in a circle. The bottom line is this: we must determine our criteria of justification prior to determining our criteria of justification. Does everyone hear that? That is the point that I have been hammering about 50 times today. Do you guys see this? Let's read it again. The bottom line is this. I'm just repeating Manion's point, Manion's argument. We must determine our criteria of justification prior to determining our criteria of justification. And that is that's not a typo. It's a brilliant way to state this problem. And in order to do that, and so he says, and we have to do that, so that we can determine our criteria of justification. And he's pointing out how kind of like stuck in this circle or in this infinite regress the foundationalist or the coherentist is. We must determine our criteria of justification prior to determining our criteria of justification so that we can use it to determine our criteria of justification. If we recognize that this is a problem that is in principle unsolvable This is the whole point, guys. The point here is not to accept foundationalism, not to accept coherentism. The point is to say this is unsolvable. Then we will realize and save ourselves considerable time and headache by not chasing a bunch of dumb solutions that don't work. And they only appear to work because they obfuscate the problem. Yes, exactly. Now I think these quotes, if I recall, in this next section, Nicholas Everett, that one's really good. We might as well just go ahead and launch into the next part of this. I probably should have just read the entire paper. Like, ultimately, that would have been the best mode here. But we'll open it back up to Q&A here in a second. But, all right, so let me pull up this page for you guys. You guys can see the next section. All right, so this is a great quote here, if I recall. Nicholas Everett in his book, here, just again, guys, just standard epistemology text. Nicholas Everett in his book, Modern Epistemology, says of the current state of analysis, quote, "The search for foundations has been unsuccessful. It has failed in mathematics. It has failed in science. All particular proposals have failed, and it fails in principle." Everett concludes with this question: Given this inevitable failure, what, if anything, is left for the epistemologist to do? So when you guys have heard me repeating this point over and over and over, that there's nowhere else left to go with foundationalism, and that modern epistemology is at a dead end because of this, that's why you hear me constantly bringing back in Hume. And it's not to accept Hume, it's to point out Hume's good arguments. Yes, Hume can make a good argument on an empiricist ground, on an empiricist system, in the atheist worldview. Doesn't mean I think Hume is a good man. Doesn't mean I think Hume's system is correct or his worldview is right. Hume is the consistent atheist. That's the point here, you see. We want to drive the atheist, drive the opponent to consistency on his own grounds. That's what we are doing in apologetics and in this exercise. That's what we do. Okay? It's not to convince people of Humeanism. It's not to make people skeptics. It's to make people realize that the end result of their presuppositions should lead them logically to skepticism. And if they are led to skepticism, their position falls apart and they don't have an argument against God, against theism, against Christianity. That's the point. Manion says, as we've already seen, the foundationalist can provide no justification for his belief in causality, identity, externality, the self, logic, induction, etc. And if you want to see the rest of that, that's in the paper. I will link the paper. You can go read the Manion paper for yourself. But the skeptic would give these problems a little more emphasis and, in fact, draw our attention to more problems. Now, when he launches into this external world problem, that's the section, that's the argument that he will appropriate that you heard me use earlier, right? Remember how I kept stressing the problem from Kant earlier? The phenomenal noumenal question. How do we know that our conceptual mental schema that we think is logic and reasoning and abstract concepts, how do we know that that matches up to anything in the external world? Right? I'm not agreeing with Kant. I'm appropriating this question as a defeater for foundationalism. As we have seen, the foundationalists can raise the bar and say, hey, what about the external world? We have already seen from Berkeley to Hume that man cannot justify his belief in the external world. Kant said it was one of the greatest scandals of science and philosophy that there was no proof of the existence of the external world. But we can make no distinction between because we can make no distinction between our internal world of thought and the external world on atheist empiricist grounds, okay? On the unbelieving ground, on the rationalist grounds, not on the Orthodox grounds. Okay, I'm not affirming this when I read this or say this. This is an argument for their position, on their position. Okay, so people out there who get confused, I am not affirming this view. I am speaking of and explaining an argument, not my view. It is a good argument against this view. Because we got a lot of slow boys that get caught up in this. They can't tell the difference between making an argument and accepting that position. And so if I was an empiricist, if I was a rationalist, if I was in any of these systems, the problem of the external world is a completely valid question to ask. It is not a problem for the Christian paradigm because we do not have these starting points. Do you see that? That's the point. I am not a foundationalist. I don't begin my beliefs from empirical data starting points. I don't begin my worldview, my system, from rationalism or the cogito. So I do not have these problems in my worldview because I do not accept these position starting points. If you do not accept my worldview, the Christian paradigm, then you will be subject to these problems. That's the point here. Now, maybe you think you're not subject to these problems. Okay. Feel free to come and bring your argument as to why you are not caught in these problems. Now, the last 500 years of epistemology says we're all caught in these problems in secular academia and in unbelief. But now, if you're an outlier and you've solved this, you are more than welcome to come on and give your solution to these problems. Again, Kant said is one of the greatest scandals of science and philosophy that there's not actually a proof of the existence of the external world. Because we can make no distinction between our internal world of thought, okay, that's what I meant by conceptual schema, right? And the external world, we cannot know what we call the external world is not just a form of our internal world. So do you understand that to an empiricist or even to a rationalist, this is a devastating critique? Because it means that their system cannot justify any statements about the world. You can have all kinds of beliefs about the world, but you're not going to be able to justify those beliefs without solving this insoluble dilemma to these systems. Again, does everybody see this? It's not a very difficult point. In fact, it's in a scandalous way really simple. And it does not mean for the 1,000th time, slow boys, that I agree with Kantianism. Kant is saying, there is this problem. I am the Immanuel Kant. I'm from Germany, Austria. I don't even remember if he was from Austria or not, but we'll say he is. There is the problem from Hume. David Hume has given us this problem of the external world. And if you read from David Hume, you will devise a series of problems that cannot be answered. And if we agree that the world is either a mental construct, or if we agree that knowledge begins with sense data, we cannot prove that there is an external world. Good. So there's my Kant impression. Of course, we don't have any. There's no proof of Kant's inflection and tone. There's a YouTube video that you can go watch the interview with David with Immanuel Kant if you want. That's a joke, dummies. So that's what's being said here, right? Now, from the Christian perspective, that's I can sit here and say, oh, thank you, Emmanuel. That's actually a really good insight and a really good argument for these secular unbelieving systems that they're false, fraudulent, and they fail. So thank you for that argument, Kant. By the way, I don't accept your system because your system basically makes knowledge impossible also. So you guys see that this presuppositional critique applies as well to Kant, right, and his system. So we're not Kantian. And in fact, Kant's system is a gigantic failure. It's ridiculous. It's just another version of human system building. Now, does Kant have insights? Yes, he does. And his insight here is to say, hey guys, how are we going to answer these problems that Hume has raised? How are we going to do science if we can't prove there's an external world? And by the way, if you read the Scientific Outlook, Bertrand Russell says this is still the case. No one has proven the external world. And that's in the first few chapters of Scientific Outlook. And Bertrand Russell says, but we're just going to set this aside and move on because we can't solve this problem. He says that in the book. He's like, yeah, okay, so from Hume and Kant all the way up till now, there's no proof of the external world, but I don't know, man. Let's just act like there is an external world. And that's literally what philosophy and science do, is they say, look, dude, we'll just ignore this question. We're going to pretend that there is an external world. Therefore, we cannot know that the external world even exists. Quine admits, quote, again, representing this tradition, the empiricist tradition in the 20th century, physical objects are conceptually imported as convenient intermediaries. Did you hear this? The notion that there are physical objects that are conceptually imported into our worldview, into our theory, into our epistemology, our theory of knowledge, are convenient intermediaries. They are comparable epistemologically to the gods of Homer. Do you guys remember how many times we've had atheists come in and say, oh, do you believe in sentences, meaning, concepts, the external world? And every atheist, yes, I do. Oh, okay, so then that's literally of the same ontological epistemic status as the gods of Homer.
What? That's crazy. How dare you? That's insane. You don't even know what you're talking about, word salad.
I'm repeating the argument from one of the most famous philosophical essays of the 20th century. Quine's point right here. He's not saying that the gods of Homer are real. He's not saying physical objects are the gods. Okay, slow boys. No, he's saying conceptually imported notions like physical objects are of the same epistemic status as the gods of Homer, because neither of them can be justified or known for sure to exist or be the case without assuming them to exist and be the case. For my part, Quine says, I do believe in physical objects, and I do not believe in Homer's gods. But when it comes to the point of epistemic footing, physical objects and the gods differ only in degree and not in kind. Exactly. Thank you so much, WVO Quine, because you are giving great ammo to us apologists, to us who look at epistemology in terms of worldviews and paradigms, and who can never get tired of pointing out to the atheist materialist that your belief in meaning, your belief in abstract objects and concepts and logic literally has no better footing than the gods of Homer in your worldview, in your paradigm, in your system. The self. We should also make note of a few more observations about our notion of the self, because this has been the autonomous man's most confident assertion. Okay, so let's shift away from the empiricism of Hume and Kant to Descartes' cogito. I think, therefore I am. Man has at least been confident of his own existence. But what exactly does the term self refer to? Who are you? Are you a dream? Are you an idea? Are you an idea in the mind of a god or a demon? Right? And then Manion goes on to repeat the arguments that you heard me make of the cogito. I'm not going to repeat that for the 10th time today. But again, so if you do want to hear the critiques of the cogito, you can rewind about, 30 minutes, an hour. And we went through all of those, and Manion will go on to make those very critiques. All right, so let's move past that, because that was, I think, really good overview of the critique of the foundationalist enterprise in the history of philosophy. And let's look a little bit over here at Paul's approach to apologetics, revelational epistemology, theonomous epistemology, right? So all of the worldviews out there, all of man's systems, for the most part, right, unless it's another religious system, are going to essentially be a form of autonomous epistemology, reasoning as if there's no God, and then the human mind and reasoning faculty will determine down the road if there is a place for some kind of God. Well, of course, that kind of God is no kind of God, actually. And so that's why for our position, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom and knowledge. And we're going to look and see briefly here in a second, how does St. Paul do apologetics? Does he use the classical apologist, Roman Catholic, classical theist approach? Is he Aristotelian? Does he use a bunch of syllogisms to try to argue his position. Now, let's be clear. I'm not saying that Aristotle isn't a good philosopher with insights. I'm not saying that you can't use syllogisms. But what I'm saying is that this is going to show that Paul does not do natural theology. That's what I'm going to show you. The way the Roman Catholics cash it out. And if he doesn't do natural theology, then natural theology is not the appropriate, correct anthropology theology view to have. Because natural theology operates on certain assumptions and presuppositions about, number one, man's reasoning, man's nature, the fall, right? As if the fall didn't affect man's reasoning, etc., etc., etc. Thank you, Jay, $25. This is a new question on the nous and Paul's trichotomy of body, soul, and spirit. In some places, it seems like nous and pneuma are conflated. In other places, it seems like nous is a faculty of the psyche and the pneuma is something else. Does it depend on context? Excellent question, and yes, it does. And I remember early on, it was kind of confusing to me too, because if you go to Orthodox Info, there's a couple good articles on this. Just go over to Orthodox Info and search nous, and you'll get different articles. And if you read all of those, I think there's 2 or 3 they have there, you'll see that question is actually addressed in a couple of the articles there. And then if you go to Metropolitan Herodios Vlachos' book, Orthodox Psychotherapy, he has a really good treatment of the nous in that. So those will help answer this question. But part of the reason for the confusion in that regard is that the word can also at times refer to the mind. So sometimes nous can refer to the intellectual faculty. Sometimes nous can be referring to a more Hebraic notion of the heart. And I think that, like in Romans, these passages, Paul's using it in the sense of the heart. And in fact, I think in Acts 17, Paul will even use and refer to the nous, which is, it's not exclusive to the mind, but the heart is not identical to the mind, right? And that's why in Orthodox theology, if you read the best treatment of the nous in terms of epistemology is St. Justin Popovich's book, Orthodox Faith and Life in Christ. And there's a chapter called The Theory of Knowledge of St. Isaac the Syrian. Okay, so Orthodox epistemology is the epistemology of Isaac the Syrian. And that's what that whole chapter in that excellent book is about. And you'll notice that, guess what St. Justin Popovich says in this chapter? Oh, everything you hear me argue. The reason we don't do natural theology is that, well, number one, we're not Roman Catholics, but natural theology in the Thomistic Aristotelian sense doesn't work, right? Because it assumes, for example, that man can interpret the natural world properly without repentance. Well, we don't think that. How are you going to interpret? Let's take an example of this. When you look out at the natural world and you see predators and prey, you see death. I mean, don't most, quote, natural philosophers come to the conclusion that death is natural? Death is part of the natural world and the natural process? Okay. Does the Christian religion teach that death is natural? Absolutely not. Death is always conceived of in Scripture, in the Old Testament and the New Testament especially, as the enemy, as unnatural. And this is just a fundamental point that we disagree with the Roman Catholics about. Death is not natural. It is an unnatural aberration that has its origins in the angelic realm, aka the demons. It is not a natural phenomenon. And that is a fundamental difference between Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. Frankie D, $5. Jay, you wanker. Paganism is clearly superior. The one and the many, bro. It proves paganism. I'm sorry that I haven't caught these streams lately. I'm trying to catch up. Have you heard of a thing called the bicameral mind? I mean, isn't that like the left brain and the right brain stuff? I mean, I'm guessing that's what that is. But no, I don't really know a lot about like psychology and neuroscience, or those aren't my fields. So let's see, what does it talk about? It says bicameral mentality. Let's see what this is. Okay, so this is in the domain of psychology. It's a hypothesis in psychology and neuroscience. That's what I figured, that the human mind once operated in a state in which cognitive functions were divided between Okay, yeah. I think that there's some of that touches on what the noose and Orthodox psychotherapy is getting at, but it's much more than this, right? It's not, the noose is not a reasoning mental faculty, right? It's a distinct organ that God gave man to know God directly. And that's a unique Orthodox teaching. So I think that some of this bicameral stuff, I remember, who's the guy who just yells and cusses nonstop? Mark Pazio, right? I remember hearing a lecture a long time ago about Mark Pazio on this topic. And I think he had some interesting insights, right? That the left brain, right brain, or whatever, that it's intended to function together. And so, yes, I do think there is something to this. However, it's not really what the Orthodox doctrine of the noose is about, but it could have reference to it. So great question. Yeah, that's fascinating stuff. Andrew, $5. If I said I am God and I am the standard of truth, and then I asked myself, how is that possible? And then I went back to the former statement, is that epistemic bootstrapping and circularity? Yes. So when Manion is asking these questions of jumpstart, right? That's epistemic bootstrapping. Okay, well, I'm going to start with this one, and I'm going to build my worldview from this. Remember in the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris podcast, right? About the middle of that, when we were critiquing it, Sam Harris starts saying, just give me raw experience with no presuppositions, nothing theory laden. I just want to boil down to meditate to get some raw sense data experience and then try to build up from there. That is epistemic bootstrapping par excellence. And so your example was, I am God and I'm the standard of truth. Yeah, I think that would be a cult leader's attempt at epistemic bootstrapping, right? So yeah, we could say all the cult leaders are engaged in this to a degree because their final reference point for for authority and for epistemic certitude is themselves in their own God status. Great question. Bill Gates, $5. Uh-oh. By the way, I had a dream. I met Bill Gates at a dinner. I was getting nervous because like, oh man, this dude's gonna have me killed. So as soon as this my food poisoned. But Gil Bates says, do you believe in that technocracy is an evil political system in itself? Well, let's start with, first of all, in itself. So nothing is evil in itself. Right? In the Orthodox view, evil is a privation in the metaphysical sense, and in the moral sense, evil is defined as a movement of the will away from the good. So nothing in itself, no system in itself, is inherently evil. However, when evil men run a technocracy, then it's bad news, and that's my concern. So theoretically, if the world was run by a bunch of angels, could we have a just utopian technocracy? Absolutely, sure. It would. I'm sure it would be an amazing, I don't know, Atlantis type scenario, right? In terms of like the most ridiculous, the way all the conspiratards talk about Atlantis. And yes, I am a conspiratard myself, but I don't believe that Atlantis was like spaceships and utopia, right? So, I mean, if it was like run by angels, yeah, I'm sure we could have a utopia, right? But men are fallen, and so to have these kinds of systems in place where you're going to have like, AI determining who lives and dies, AI deciding that euthanasia, you die at age 30. I mean, that just sounds like a nightmare to me. And that's what every dystopian story is about. Do you believe that modern technocrats are evil? Absolutely. I can't think of any technocrat that is in any way virtuous whatsoever. I mean, you guys have heard, we do the Global Elites book series. We lecture through 50 to 60 writings of the elite now. They all unanimously agree on an anti-human, anti-natalist, depopulation, dysgenics, transhumanist agenda. So I cannot. Here's a challenge: somebody find a virtuous technocrat. How's that for a challenge? Is overpopulation a legitimate issue? Yeah, we covered this on yesterday's Twitter space. So I think in certain places, these like giant Chinese high-rise places, right? Slums and whatnot, there is overpopulation because you have a tyrannical government that intentionally crowds people into these places and intentionally wants people to get into cities. This is actually part of social engineering. The Royal Society talked about this. Getting people into cities actually promotes the idea that there is overpopulation. But if you look at the Earth, I mean, the Earth is vast, right? There's like plenty of space for people to live. I mean, it's just vast. I mean, the last few years, I've driven coast to coast in the U.S. multiple times. And, you get up into like Montana and these places, it's like, I mean, you drive for hours and you don't see anything, right? You might see one trailer here and there. And yeah, granted, some of that land is not livable, but a lot of it is. So there are places where there is the problem of overpopulation, but it's not actually the population itself that is the problem. And if you look at the Club of Rome, and if you look at a lot of these globalist entities, they're not actually concerned with overpopulation. That's a ruse. What they actually want to do is kill most people, give their descendants the future, the world, and then merge with robots and ultimately get rid of all humans. So remember that overpopulation is a ruse for transhumanism and the plan to ultimately get rid of all humans. Literally. And that's straight out of the top technocrats and the top global elites themselves. And we've covered that in, as we said, over 50, almost 60 books now. Gil Bates again. Do you think Technocracy... Oh, he's repeating himself. Sorry you repeated yourself. If you want your $5 back, you could email me or DM me. I'd be glad to give you your $5 back if you didn't mean to send $5. Palantir, $3. Jay, can you give your opinion on something? I'm looking into Orthodox Study Bible Companion with supplementary reading. And I encountered the set by Archpriest Lawrence Farley. Is this a good set in your view? Thank you. I do not have that set, so I don't know if it's good or bad. I've never heard anything bad about Father Lawrence Farley, so I would guess that it's probably okay, but I don't know. But good question. Andrew, $5. How is God more certain than I? I'm Orthodox, but this is a question that's been bothering me. Well, because, again, if you want to ask, it's a question of starting points, right? So if we're asking a question about certitude in relation to starting points, why? I mean, well, let's put it this way. In terms of objective factuality, in our view, the certitude of your existence and the certitude of the proposition God exists is the same, right? It's not like there's something inherently more certain about the propositions themselves. But in the domain of metaphysics, God's existence is more necessary, more certain, because God's existence is necessary for you to be able to say, I exist. So I would cash that out as two different domains, right? Epistemically speaking, the truthfulness is the same. But in terms of metaphysics, you couldn't have the epistemology at all if God himself didn't exist and ground epistemology as a whole. So they're two different domains. One's a paradigm level, right, with the question of God's existence. But Descartes' cogito is not a foundation for any kind of paradigm. And that's the point of the critique of the cogito. All right. Anybody in the chat? I don't see anybody there. Does anybody want to come on and chat and speak? We've been going for a good while now. Over 2 hours. We still got 80 people in the chat. Does anybody want to come on, ask any questions, make any arguments, have any debate, any discussion? Hopefully today will be useful, though. I do want to close with the points from Acts 17. And remember, guys, tonight, Jamie is premiering her podcast. I'll put that in the chat for you guys if you want to watch that after this stream. So Jamie's going to be doing her podcast. I'm actually going to go watch that because I don't know some of these mad science experiments that they read about and discovered. So I'm eager to learn some of these new mad science experiments that they're going to be exposing. Anybody else before we go to how Paul approaches apologetics in Acts 17? Prince Makil. Where'd he go? I guess he left. or it didn't work. All right. Why is he back? Let's see. Here's several. Sam, what's up, Sam? Go ahead. Just unmute if you want to, Sam.
Oh, hey Jay.
What's up, dude?
Are you a tits or an ass guy?
Right. So again, we get the pagans who want to troll. Anybody else want to come on and Shadia Proper? What's up, Shadia? By the way, keep in mind that so the Roman Catholics, the pagans, these people who have been invited multiple times to come and make their arguments, their case, this is what they have. Like all they have is this kind of like teenage level, like butt jokes. I mean, it's like, and they think that's edgy. They think that's like, I don't know what, right? They don't have anything. So I actually feel sorry for those dudes, but whatever. What's up?
Well, I guess I'm trying to understand, like, I understand when you're saying if somebody's fully committed to a certain system, they have to explain these critiques for them, but it seems like your system includes like some form of coherentism and fideism, but how do you avoid like having to answer those pitfalls that those systems fall into? Well,
the point of that whole exercise is to say that it's a holistic system that's in question here. So in other words, what's at dispute between me and the atheist, for example, isn't this or that fact or this or that principle or point or starting point. What's ultimately at dispute is two completely different paradigms of philosophy, two different paradigms of how we give an account for knowledge, ethics, and metaphysics. That's the point of the transcendental argument, is that it's a comparison of paradigms. You can't resolve the dispute or the debate by this or that specific detail or fact. That's why it's epistemic holism.
But then doesn't that fall into the critique that you said of the Roman Catholic guy earlier, where you're saying if I can't imagine anything else being the case?
No, because it's not stopping with that. I might say that your system is self-defeating or leads to absurdity, but I'm not stopping there. There's the additional point that my system actually can give an account and a justification for the possibility of knowledge. So it goes one step further than that. If it just stopped with saying that, well, I don't see how it could be any other way because your system is reduced to absurdity, that might be a valid critique. But we're going beyond that and we're saying, but also my worldview actually does give an account for knowledge. It does give justification.
Okay. And I guess that's, so in your account, I guess, if it has these elements of fideism or, coherentism, how do you give the account with avoiding those pitfalls that you just kind of went over?
Right, because number one, I'm not a foundationalist, so I'm not making the point that my starting point for knowledge is arbitrary or just some random thing. That's why we're arguing that this is the strong point for revelational epistemology. That's why theonomous reasoning and using scripture and the Christian worldview as my starting point itself doesn't subject me to these problems. Because how do I know that I can trust, for example, let's take Hume's problem of induction, right? This fundamental problem of how do we know the future will be like the past? How do I know there's an external world? Well, my answer is God created the world. The world operates in a regular fashion through divine providence, and that gives me a basis for belief in induction. God has promised that the seasons will continue in their succession until the end of the world. And so all of these things actually do give an account for an explanation for how regularity in nature is possible. I have a belief in logic because I believe in abstract principles which are grounded ultimately in the mind of God. So I have all of these arguments that I can make that explain and give an account. That's my story, basically, of how man has the possibility of knowledge. And so when I contrast my story with the atheist story, and that's why I'm using the word story here. I don't mean in the sense of just made up. I'm saying you have a story, I have a story. You have assumptions, I have assumptions. You have starting points, I have starting points. We're not going to resolve it by picking out this or that starting point. We're going to resolve the dispute, the debate in the transcendental argument by comparing whose story can make sense of the possibility of knowledge, ethics, and metaphysics.
Okay, and so I guess, would you say the starting point, I mean, that might be a bad term, but would be revelation?
Yeah, if you do want to use there's nothing wrong with the word starting point itself, right? I mean, part of the point in Manion's paper is that, the jumpstart question is a question for anybody. And so for me as an Orthodox Christian, well, my starting point is divine revelation. So that's what grounds and gives me an account for the world, the past, the future, the self, abstract concepts, logic, etc. That's my starting point. It's not the only thing I look to. I mean, I have a high view of logic and reasoning, so all of those things factor in. But I'm not going to assume atheism and then pick, because I can't do that. Like, it doesn't make sense in my system, right? My worldview, it wouldn't make sense in my worldview. It would be contradictory against my worldview for me to act like there are self-evident principles and I can pretend that God doesn't exist to have common ground with an atheist. It's not even honest to do that.
Right. So I think what an atheist might think there was they would try to then put revelation into one of these categories. Like, they'd say revelation has to be based on like faith only, or revelation has to be based on,
but it's not, right? So
those things you're saying?
Well, it can't be reduced to any of those things. So in other words, let me put it this way. What is being argued for is an entire paradigm, and that includes divine revelation, God's existence, the incarnation, the Bible, the history of the church. All of those things are actually part of the argument.
Okay, but would those things all have been learned through revelation?
No, hold on. Not all of those things. So some of those things are, the content is divine revelation. Some of those things are history. Some of those things are logic. Some of those things are, all kinds of different things. Like, I mean, I believe that I have I'm a self. I believe in the existence of the self. But I am not divine revelation per se.
Okay, so that's where it can sort of look like a coherent type of view, but
there is an element of coherentism, yeah.
Right, I see what you're saying.
Because it's epistemic holism, correct?
Yeah, I guess I've always tried to understand. Well, obviously Revelation doesn't neatly fit into one of these categories, but try to explain it to maybe like a materialist or someone who wants those type of definitions, like to try to explain revelation to somebody. They're like, well, it's just it's just this guy in a cave who didn't eat a bunch of foods experiences, or it's just someone's interpretation of this scripture that was given to them through God. Like, that's maybe how they would understand revelation.
That's true. Yeah. Right. So our presupposition, I understand that that's how they would view it, but no, our presupposition is different. And it's operating on the assumption of inspiration. So we think it is the Word of God. And so divine revelation for us is, the body of doctrines that Christ and the apostles handed down to the church. So for us, that's the content of divine revelation, both written and oral. So for us, that's the totality story, that we have to make sense of the world and give justification, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that's not exclusive, or that's not mutually exclusive to philosophy, to logic, to science, to any of those domains. We think all those domains make perfect sense within the Christian worldview and paradigm. I mean, if God exists and has created a world that operates with regularity, if there's free will, if there's man has dignity because he's made in the image of God, then we have a basis for ethics, for morals. If the world has an end by which it's directed by an intentional being, then there's telos, there's purpose. God creates a world with beings that have their own causal agency. Now we have causality. I mean, on and on and on. These principles and problems that historically plague secular philosophy aren't really problems if the Christian paradigm is true, right? So does that mean that I'm just saying, well, it's true because I think it's true? No, I'm saying the proof for it being true is that if it was not true in all of these different aspects and components in a holistic way, then knowledge would ultimately become impossible. That's the argument.
Okay, right. So it's not so much like, yeah, it's almost like these things that were learned through revelation, the more science and just the more that life exists, these things are proven through all these other methods to be the case, as opposed to just sort of saying.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah. I mean, I think that science does attest to design and a creator, but if you were arguing with an atheist, he's going to say, well, you're just assuming and interpreting it as design, but it may not be. So I don't use design arguments and these kinds of things typically, because ultimately that's not what the debate is, right? I'm going to take the debate with a guy that says that to a more fundamental level about the possibility of knowledge at all. And that's what we were just today was focusing on that. Why is epistemology such a big deal? Why do I keep bringing the debate back to that question with these people? That's all I was trying to do today. But there are times, you're right, when maybe we do need to look at the testimony of science and evidences, right? So I'm not opposed to evidences. I just don't think evidences function on their own without a paradigm, without a theory.
Right, and then that you just laid out there is distinct from what the Roman Catholic guy that you had mentioned. I got on after that discussion,
Correct.
But that he was trying to say, like,
Right.
I can't see the opposite as being the case, as opposed to saying, like, your worldview that you're saying, it's not like just my perspective, I can't see it. Like, no one has been able to put out a defeater for this. Like, there's never been another worldview that can get put together that can give an account for knowledge.
Right. So basically, again, partly for the Roman Catholic, they're bound to a foundationalist epistemology, I would argue. Now, maybe there's some Roman Catholic out there who thinks they're not. I mean, I don't see how they could make sense of that in their view, just because there's just so many dogmatic and, traditional Roman Catholic views and statements about, Aquinas, his importance, the catechism's discussions of the classical arguments, classical theism seems just bound up with the Roman Catholic tradition. So maybe there's a Roman Catholic out there who could argue that they're not a foundationalist. I don't see how that's tenable or possible, but 99.9% of them aren't that way. So let's set that aside for the moment. And the approach that a Roman Catholic has is going to be constrained by the problems of foundationalism. So all I'm doing with those debates with those people is just repeating the arguments of David Hume. Basically, that's it. And that's all the paper today was doing. And the smartest amongst them, you're correct, will respond by saying, well, Aristotle responds to this argument with retorsion, where he says there's not really any other way to do philosophy or to do logic if you don't assume these things. And I totally agree with that. The only problem is that still doesn't grant a foundationalist epistemic justification. And that's why this is so crucial.
Okay, I got it. Yeah, so there's them saying nothing else works doesn't prove what they're saying works.
Exactly, because I have a defeater for that. Because I can bring in David Hume or the brain in a vat, or Father Deacon uses the schizophrenics, right? Like, what if we're just schizophrenics and we think that reality, matches up to logic and to our first principles, but it really doesn't, but we're just duped into thinking it does? Or what if, the Manion paper was making the argument for the defeater for that is to say, well, maybe we're just psychologically predisposed to think that our mental categories like logic and our abstract concepts match up to the external world. But how do we know that they do? And if a foundationalist tries to bring in all these other arguments, then that foundational belief isn't actually foundational anymore. It wasn't self-evident.
Right, makes sense.
Hold on, let me... okay, yeah, go ahead.
But what if they were to say that same kind of schizophrenic idea, but they just put that with the, Orthodox worldview of God? That this is something that was just kind of cooked up and conceived by... Well,
the point is that the problem of the external world isn't a problem for a Christian, because he believes God created the world, because divine revelation says there is an external world. It's created by God to operate in a regular fashion, divine providence, etc. So it's only a problem for a person who adopts a system that's going to be built from the ground up by human sense data, you see.
Right.
Or Descartes' rationalism. Either of those systems is a human system building project that is only a problem for the person who says, my starting point, think about Descartes' starting point. I think, therefore I am. It's a totally autonomous, human-oriented, human starting point. What does God say? I am that I am. And now I'm just contrasting these two statements because for the Christian, for the Orthodox Christian, his epistemology is going to be directed towards and based on a self-revealing, self-referencing God who says, I am that I am, and man must submit to that for his world to work, for his system to work, to be coherent, etc. But Descartes, David Hume, any of these people, their system is, I start with me. The only difference between Hume and Descartes is, Descartes says, I start with my mind. My mind is the beginning of all predication and rationality. Hume says, no, it's my sense data. My sense data is the starting point for all knowledge, right?
Right.
And so now you have you've bitten off a big chunk problem in epistemology. Okay, so build your system, make it work, but none of it's going to work until you justify your first principles.
Yeah. No, thanks. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, thank you. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and close this out. Thank you guys. We had a good discussion tonight. We've been going for a while, but Jamie's podcast is premiering, so go check out her podcast over at her channel, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. To guys on YouTube, I will do the Acts 17 discussion next time, so that'll be the next discussion.